From Abuja.
It's all about the human struggle to raise the level of living. That's what it's all about. I'm Magnus Packel, and this is Magnus Packel GVA. I appreciate you being a part of our show. In view today, government debt and development. How capital market development and debt sustainability are critical for economic growth and development. But before that, let's take a quick view on the importance of micro, small, and medium enterprises in Africa. The small and medium enterprises sector in Africa is characterized by a huge number of micro enterprises. Most companies are small because of legal and financial obstacles, and also because quite often there is not a linkage between large firms and small companies in Africa. The value chain is often broken, or quite often not well developed. Why are SMEs so important? In high-income countries, SMEs contribute almost 50% of gross domestic product. In low-income countries, the proportion is sometimes about 16%. In the Asia-Pacific countries, around 40% of total employment is contributed by SMEs, and SME output accounts for between 60 and 80% of GDP. However, in Africa, the contribution of SMEs to GDP is only about 10%. In general, SMEs are extremely important because they contribute to employment growth at a higher rate than larger firms do. And in the longer term, they provide a significant share of overall employment. SMEs also help to increase competitiveness in the marketplace and thereby decrease the monopolistic positions of large enterprises that otherwise would limit output and employment. SMEs also help develop and promote entrepreneurial skills and innovation and play an important part in the provision of services in communities. They also focus on local production and skills, and all this would ensure that skills and knowledge are made to flourish in the local area. Adding capacity training in key areas like mechanic shops and tailoring shops, hairdressing and barbering, traditional catering, electrical repairs, radio, television, refrigerator repairs, furniture designs and carpentry, plumbing and masonry, merchandising and retail trade are paying dividends and boosting incomes across Africa. Fortunately, economic reforms across Africa are beginning to focus on strengthening the private sector as a way of creating jobs and raising the level of living. Still in view, debt management and economic development. But up next, the hidden economics of consumer regulations. People often rant against regulation. However, there are times when it is clear that regulation is really good economics. If you want to buy a used car, how do you, the buyer, truly know what condition the car is in? If we want to purchase insurance, how does the insurer really get the truth about the condition of the thing being insured? Anytime the flow of information is not assured between the buyer and the seller, the government may want to come and help us. Many people, when buying a car, only look at how it looks. If it looks good, they buy it. That's not the way you should ever buy a used car. We need it to be required that every used car be certified by well-accredited mechanic shops. In this manner, when you want to buy a car, you want to be sure you are getting value for your money. If you are insuring something, the insurer would need a piece of paper, a document that they can hold to validate whatever claims the insured is making. This must be enforced by the government. It does a few things for society. It can create jobs for those doing the validation, and by the way, their contract will be terminated and they will lose their jobs if they provide false information. Most of all, this kind of regulation gives a lot of information to the people so they can make decisions that make them happy. For now, before the regulations come in, when you are trying to buy a used vehicle, don't just get excited by the look of it. Check how old the vehicle is, what year it was made. Finally, check under the hood. That's the bonnet. What you don't check there can make you very happy or indeed very sad as you drive down the road. Our hidden economics for you. Toward the middle of the 1990s, many developing countries became severely weighed down and weakened by unsustainable debt burdens. In 1996, the World Bank and the IMF launched the so-called Heavily Indebted Poor Country Initiative, HIPC, a debt relief program designed to reduce the external debt burdens of the most heavily indebted poor countries to sustainable levels. About 33 of the 39 HIPC countries were African. Although Nigeria was classified as being too rich to qualify as a highly indebted poor country at that time, about 18 billion of Nigeria's debt was nevertheless forgiven after it paid $12 billion upfront to the Paris Club. Recently, I spoke with Dr. Abraham Wankwa, the dynamic and very knowledgeable Director General of the Nigeria Debt Management Office. Dr. Wankwa holds a PhD in economics from the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. Please join me in my discussion with Dr. Abraham Wankwa. So, DG, it appears that things are getting much better across the board now in Africa in terms of Africa's debt profile. When we compare it with the period from the late 90s, say from 1996 when the whole HIPC, that is the Highly Indebted Poor Country Initiative, was started, and then reinforced in 1999 when the debt as a percent of GDP was getting really high across Africa. But in recent times, say from 2008 or so, it appears that the debt profile is much better. Debt as a percent of GDP coming down a little bit. Now, well, what does this mean? Now, does this mean now that we have debt sustainability across Africa?
I think your observation is very right with regards to the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, the HIPC, which was introduced in 1996. And the whole idea was for resource-rich creditor countries in particular and the multilateral financial institutions to find ways of significantly reducing the debt burden of the poorer countries, much of which had become unsustainable. Among the HIPCs, of course, we are 30 African countries out of the 36 HIPC countries. Africa accounted for about 30.
Wow.
And by the time the initiative went underway, as much as $76 billion was written off in terms of debt relief for these countries taken together. So you would appreciate then the impact it would have in making the debt of most of these African countries to become sustainable. Of course, this was enhanced by 2000 when the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, spearheaded by the World Bank, IMF, and the African Development Fund came into being, which was when these multilateral financial institutions decided for eligible debts to do 100% write-off of their own components of the debts of these countries. So certainly with these initiatives, most of the African countries that we are hitherto very debt overburdened, had achieved the sustainable situations. And they have attempted to maintain this new status. And of course, you remember that the granting of debt relief under HIPC and non-HIPC were accompanied by various reform requirements. And the good thing is that most of these countries sustain the path of reform after securing debt relief. So that's helped a lot. In the Nigerian case, of course, Nigeria was not really a hippie country.
Yes.
It did obtain debt relief under special, peculiar circumstances, thanks to the dogged efforts of the then president, the then Honorable Minister of Finance, Dr. Misingojo Konjiwala, and the team at the Debt Management Office, who had to use some creative, innovative ways to be able to convince the creditor countries to grant Nigeria debt relief substantial, even though it wasn't a hippie country.
A hippie country, yes.
Yeah, so everything taken into account, Nigeria is a good example of a country that took advantage of the requirements for obtaining debt relief to push forward with reforms and sustain those reforms. And so, yes, you could say that in terms of debt sustainability, things are overall much better all over Africa. For most countries in Africa, Ghana, Uganda, Kenya, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Liberia.
Yeah. So, but now, in terms of the so-called debt, say we were to do a debt sustainability analysis, can we say that the things that caused the debt to soar almost out of control over that period, have they disappeared? Have they gone away now, or are they still there? I know we have the reforms you've talked about in Nigeria, for example, done very well in that area. Other countries also done well. But all those things that caused the debt to rise so much that we needed forgiveness, have they gone away without reforms?
Let me hazard this. The things that would cause debt unsustainability, not only in African countries, but in any country, including the developed countries, are permanently present in every economy. And that's why you can see, you can see the crisis, debt crisis in Europe.
In Europe,
you can see, what we call a quasi-debt crisis even in the United States of America. So the factors that could manifest, could develop to debt crisis, to unsustainable debt, are present in every economy, in every age.
That means that means you've got a lot of work to do there, because then the burden is on your head. So let me pick up on that and then say, as the Director General of the Debt Management Office in Nigeria, what are you going to do if those things are still there? What will you do to be sure that Nigeria does not fall prey to the situation again?
Let me emphasize again, for every country, not African country, not only underdeveloped countries, not only developing countries, but include developed countries. What is different from country to country and from time to time, from age to age, is the capacity of the relevant institutions responsible for putting those factors, those impulses under control, how effective the institutions are, how much skills people have, how much commitment, how much regulatory resilience and persistence are available. And so what has happened for most countries in Africa was that, having exited from the problematic debt overhang, they went on a path of institutionalizing effective public debt management. And a good example, of course, is Nigeria.
Absolutely.
Now what it means, you now establish appropriate institutions, appropriate procedures, build appropriate capacities to make sure you have a handle on, you have a continuous monitoring, effective control, effective analysis, and effective tracking and management of the forces around the public debt to make sure that you remain on a salutary path. And that's what we've done in Nigeria.
And in Nigeria, like Nigeria, how difficult has that been? Given our democracy, given our federal structure and all of that, how difficult or easy has that been for you?
Of course, being a federal system makes it a little much more difficult, not a little difficult, much more difficult. And that's why in our own posture in Nigeria, we have taken the deliberate decision since 2007 to say that public debt management in Nigeria cannot be a one-office affair. Because we appreciate we don't have just one government. We have one federal government, we have 36 state governments, and we have 774 local governments. And in particular, we appreciate that the state governments have very high powers of fiscal autonomy. Therefore, you cannot talk of effective public debt management in Nigeria by simply having a central debt management office. You needed to have very effective public debt management offices, institutions, in each of the 36 states. And that's why we took the initiative with the support of the federal government, with the support and blessing of the supervisory board of the Debt Management Office, which is chaired by the Vice President, to establish Debt Management Department for each state of the Federation. Yes. Now, we are not establishing branches of the DMO in each state. What we are doing is to help each and every state to have its own debt management department. We build the institutions, we build their capacities, we make sure we train them, build up the skills, set up the procedures, the legal framework, and all that. And we have been doing this since 2008. And the plan is that by the end of 2012, which is the next few months, we will have 36 additional effective debt management offices in the country, instead having a very strong debt management. So that's one of the very strong ways of dealing with that issue.
But can't somebody say it doesn't matter? Okay, if a state wants to go wild in borrowing money, it's their problem. Is it really just a state's problem if they get into trouble with debt, or is it a national problem if a state in the country gets into serious debt crisis?
The Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, the Debt Management Office Act, as well as the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007,
yes,
we are very sensitive to the fact that public debt management issues are not issues you will leave to various tiers of government to handle on their own. They are issues that must be handled in a coordinated manner. Therefore, for example, the Fiscal Responsibility Act makes it clear that states cannot borrow externally, for example, without the guarantee of the federal government.
But the question is there some vicarious punishment or burden that we carry federally from a state that has not minded its debt situation very well?
Of course, because we have only one economy. We have the central government, we have the state government, we have 774 local governments, but we have only one economy.
Okay.
Therefore, whatever goes wrong in one of the tiers or in one of the governments also affect the total economy. And that's why these laws I have mentioned have ensured that the issue of public debt management is a coordinated one. It's not an issue left to the individual governments to handle on their own. That's why I was giving the example that, for example, no state of the Federation can borrow externally without the guarantee of the federal government. Indeed, what does happen is that all the external borrowing states do are done by the federal government and then on-lent to the states, which means, for example, all the World Bank loans, all the IFAD loans that we talk about, which are owned not just by the federal government but by the states, are really borrowed by the federal government and on-lent to the states.
But when the federal is borrowing this, does it know ahead of time that specific states will be making demands?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course.
So you're borrowing on their behalf?
Yes,
okay.
You borrow on their behalf, taking into account the specific projects. For example, if you are assessing a loan for rural water supply from the World Bank, the soft window, the World Bank, that is the IDA, International Development Association, or from the African Development Fund, you would have identified how many of the states are going to benefit from that water scheme before you go on to do the borrowing. Now that's for external. Now when it comes to domestic borrowing, for example, take the case of borrowing from the capital market, issuing bonds to borrow from the capital market. The provisions are so clear that no state could issue a bond in the market if it's not backed up by an ISPO, irreversible payment order, which means the federal government is authorized in advance to have direct access to the revenue stream of that state to be able to be able to have access to a full cash flow, to be able to make sure the debt is paid as and when due.
Because debt as a percent of GDP in Africa continued to average very high at around 65%, even up to 2002. In 2005, the HIPC initiative was supplemented by the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, under which the IMF, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank provided 100% relief on the eligible debts of African countries completing the HIPC initiative process. As Dr. Wankwa has just reiterated, this provision has enabled many African countries to be in a stronger position to help their people raise the level of living. What does debt relief really do for development? Well, first, debt relief frees up resources for social spending to spur development and reduce poverty. Countries that were on average spending more on debt service than on health and education combined have now reversed that situation and are now markedly increasing their expenditures on health, education, and other social services. Second, debt relief provides a breathing space to properly evaluate macroeconomic strategies. To affirm this, notice that economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa has turned stronger, climbing well over 5% for many countries. So now is the time for African countries to have well-articulated and transparent debt sustainability assessments and analysis. These analyses would include static and dynamic approaches. A dynamic approach would look down the road, perhaps up to 20 years out, to see how the debt profile would appear and what debt management steps would have to be taken to assure sustainability. In the end, it is not the debt that matters, but how you manage it. As we have just heard for Nigeria, financial market development with expansion and deepening has been one of the achievements of the government through its debt management office. Even so, the governments would have to know when to pull back off the market to avoid the crowding out of private parties needed to grow the private sector, spur experts, and create jobs. Many challenges remain. The things that in the first place caused the debt crisis and the unsustainability have not abated. Basically, many countries cannot earn enough to cover their expenditures. That's why they borrow. In addition, the capacity across Africa to manage debt is not well developed, as some countries are starting to face moderate risks of down-the-road unsustainability. Indeed, countries like the DRC are already high risk. Let this be noted right now. When we borrow, let us specify exactly what we have borrowed for. Let us not mix borrowed monies with earned funds. This can carry a moral hazard that will undermine debt sustainability. I'm Magnus Pakol, and that's my view.